How's it going, guys? Girls, hope you guys are having a great week. So I am back today, finally, with my spoiler review of The Last of Us Part 2. I finished the game over the weekend. I pretty much decided this past weekend that I had to push on and play the game just for fear of spoilers. Now, this game has been out a couple of weeks and the reactions to it have been so divisive. It's really been a game that has polarized the gaming community. You either kind of love this game or you hate this game, and feelings on the story are quite emotional, and obviously I want to weigh in and give my thoughts on it. Now, I'm going to be doing two completely separate reviews. I had to think about this clearly, how did I want to do my review, and I want to talk about the story in depth because it's probably one of the biggest controversial elements of the game. Neil Druckmann himself even said that he expected this game to be divisive, that he knew that players would either love or hate it. Now, if we go back 7 years ago, The Last of Us is considered to be a masterpiece, and one of the main reasons for that was just how incredible the story was. It was the story that really made that game. It was such a moving and heartwarming story, and it was really a very personal story about the relationship between Joel and Ellie and how they go from kind of strangers at the start of the game, really just kind of not knowing each other, putting up with each other, and by the end of the game, through the events that they go through, they really form this really strong, heartwarming bond, and they end up at the end of the game almost like father and daughter. Now, the game does end on a bit of a cliffhanger, and a lot of people at the end were like, oh my god, what is going to happen? And there were people who felt that maybe the game didn't need a sequel, and it could have finished quite nicely, quite cleanly as it was. But there were a lot of people that were interested, myself included, to see actually how the story was going to pan out. Now, one of the biggest differences I think The Last of Us Part 2 has to its predecessor is the fact that the first game is really a more personal story. It's about characters, it's about Joel and it's about Ellie, and that really is where the heart of the story lies. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so successful, just because that dynamic between Ellie and Joel really was at the heart of the game, and it really is one of the reasons that people fell in love with that game and enjoyed their experience so much. Now, The Last of Us Part 2 is a bit different in that it has much larger overarching themes. So the themes for The Last of Us Part 2 really focus on the cycle of violence and revenge, this sense of a loss of innocence and humanity, and just how difficult it can be to forgive and let go. And that really is Ellie's story, right from the beginning of the game right to the end. This struggle with hatred, with revenge, this cycle that exists between Ellie and Abby, between the WLF and the Scars. It's a constant overarching theme, and I think sometimes the story gets a little bit lost in that theme, and it really sometimes loses the core of what made the original great, which is the characters and the slow burn, and sometimes even to a degree the writing. Now, I didn't hate the story. I didn't. There were elements of it that I really enjoyed. There were parts of it that I felt could have been better, and that's really what I'm going to do in this video. I'm going to break it down. I'm going to give my thoughts and opinions on it. I'm going to look at 5 key sections really, and some of the biggest controversies that are causing this polarized view on the game. I'm going to touch on them obviously in this video, and I'm going to give generally my thoughts on it and what my opinions are in it overall. So straight off the bat, this is a spoiler warning, okay guys? If you can't tell in the title, this is going to be a completely spoiler review of The Last of Us Part 2, focusing exclusively on the story. I'm going to analyze the story all the way through. If you don't want to be spoiled, do not watch this video. Tune in for my spoiler-free review, which will be coming out probably within the next week or so. So look forward to that. But if you've played The Last of Us Part 2, you've completed the story, and you're interested to hear my thoughts on it, then absolutely this is the video for you. And I'm going to try and keep this as concise as I possibly can do. I'm going to try and keep this less than 30 minutes, but I have my notes here in front of me and they are 3 pages worth, so there's a lot that I really want to talk about. So let's delve in. Let's start by first tackling the biggest elephant in the room, which is Joel's death. I think this is initially when we had a lot of the spoilers that came out prior to the game's release, this is one of the biggest things that really tore people up, and that was the fact that Joel dies in the game. Now, their decision to kill off Joel, I didn't really have a huge problem with it. In fact, I was actually expecting it. I was expecting that Joel would not survive to the end of The Last of Us Part 2. I was expecting that he was going to have to die, and that this was going to be some kind of character development plot point for Ellie in order to either turn to revenge or possibly to turn back from revenge. I had a feeling that Joel was going to have to be sacrificed. So I wasn't massively shocked. I didn't have a huge problem with it. I didn't know that he was going to die going in because I managed to actually avoid the spoilers. So when the situation did happen, yeah, it was a shock, and it was upsetting, and I did definitely cry. You will see that from my Let's Play reaction to that. What I was really shocked about, though, was the way in which it happened, the fact that it happened so suddenly, and the fact that it happened so early on in the game. It happens pretty much in the opening prologue, right at the beginning, sort of first couple of hours of the game, and I was really surprised by that. I was expecting to see more of Ellie and Joel, and I am, naturally a little bit disappointed that we didn't get to see that. Now, I will say that the circumstances surrounding Joel's death, because obviously, as you know, Joel is killed quite brutally by Abby with a golf club. It's a really brutal scene, but the lead up to that moment really is what I initially had a little bit of an issue with, and it did seem very forced, and the writing did seem a little bit contrived, and there were even elements that for me seemed out of character just from the Joel that I know from the original game. I mean, firstly, the way in which Abby comes across them, she's chased by a horde of runners. Joel saves her life, and then obviously they're fleeing and running this horde. That seemed very convenient. What are the chances that they're going to come across each other? But then obviously Abby leads them back to her group. They manage to escape the horde, and Joel and Tommy, at this point for me, I was kind of surprised by the fact that they apparently seemed to trust Abby straight away. Tommy introduces Joel, Joel reveals his name to Abby and her group, and it just seemed a little bit out of character for the Joel that we knew from the first game. Obviously, Joel from the first game has done some pretty terrible things. I'm not surprised by the fact that these characters would want to kill him. I think there are a lot of people that Joel had a lot of enemies, but what I will say is I was surprised by the fact that he trusted this group that he didn't really know, that he hadn't met before, this quite well-armed group in their camp. I was very surprised by that. And Joel, I've always considered Joel to be quite a streetwise kind of guy, and that's one of the reasons why he survived, because he didn't really trust anyone. Now, maybe this is 4 years yet later, so maybe his relationship with Ellie has kind of mellowed him. Maybe he's regained some of his compassion, and that's why he's a little bit more trusting. This isn't the same Joel from the first game, obviously, and even in the first game he had a huge character development arc, but I was definitely surprised by that. And yeah, those events leading to his death definitely seemed a little bit contrived. Now, the way in which his death was implemented, when it first happened, my first gut feeling was just horror, complete horror at the situation. I really wanted Joel to go out kind of better. I wanted him to go out fighting. I wanted him to maybe go out protecting Ellie. And it does seem really brutal. It does seem really sudden. It does seem really senseless. But then when you actually think about it, I think the writers made that choice purposefully. They wanted the scene, they wanted his death to be so senseless, so brutal, and the way in which it's done so horrific that it creates this visceral reaction, not only in Ellie and in her reactions, but also in the player. The fact that Abby beat him to death with no remorse with a golf club makes that act incredibly personal, and it's that really sickens you to the core and makes you really hate Abby and really hate the WF, and you feel exactly what Ellie is feeling. And I remember after that just feeling this anger that I wasn't expecting. And I think that's because of the way in which the scene was drawn out. Now, what I will say is I feel that the marketing and the trailer leading up to the release of the game was incredibly misleading. And it almost seemed to imply that Joel would travel with Ellie for at least some part of her revenge quest. I thought that Jackson was going to get destroyed. Maybe Ellie would lose her girlfriend, her friends, the people that she really cares about, this peaceful life that they've grown used to, and that Ellie loses everything and kind of goes on a rampage, and that Joel would actually end up having to chase her down. And maybe you might switch between Ellie on this revenge rampage and Joel trying to catch her, trying to stop her, and ultimately maybe Joel would die protecting her, and this might actually act as the catalyst to break her out of this cycle of hatred and to learn to forgive and to learn to let go and to realize the cost of seeking this revenge. That is what I was expecting. So I was really surprised that they killed Joel at the start of the game. I will say it was a bloody bold move, and it was a risky move, certainly, because Joel obviously is one of the most beloved characters from the first game, and the relationship between him and Ellie was really one of the foundations of the first game and one of the reasons it was so successful. So the fact that they decided to do this was pretty bold, and I guess they were going for that opening shock factor, kind of like what we had in the first game when Joel's daughter died. Maybe they felt that they had to live up to the shock and the standard of that opening sequence that we had. Maybe that is one of the reasons. Then of course we go on Ellie's quest for revenge. Now Ellie's segment of the story lasts roughly about 12 hours. It's pretty linear, storyline where Ellie basically is seeking to track down the WLF and sets out pretty much to systematically track down Abby, and ends up through her revenge quest killing every member of the group responsible for Joel's death. And as she does this, we do see her gradually start to lose her humanity, and we do see this decline in her mental state as she brutally takes out each member. So we do see that Ellie, it does take a toll on her, that she does feel these deaths, but we do definitely see that this lack of humanity, and it's even apparent in the gameplay as you take down the WLF, as you take down the scars. The animations are so brutal, they're so violent, and it is really uncomfortable to play. That this is the Ellie that we know from the first game, and Ellie really was my favorite character in The Last of Us. I loved her sense of humor, I loved her sass, I loved the fact that she had a certain innocence to her because she hadn't really been out in the world, so she had a fresh perspective of looking at things and never really gave up, and that's the element of Ellie that I love. So seeing her fall from this is heartbreaking for someone that loves that character so much. Now, combined with seeing Ellie lose her humanity, there are a number of flashbacks that we do get, which is to do with memories of her with Joel, and we get to see a younger, more carefree Ellie in these scenes. We get to see snippets of the relationship between Joel and Ellie, and these were some of my favorite moments in the game. I just love them. They really made me miss Joel. They really made me miss their dynamic, and particularly the museum scene. I really enjoyed that. And then we actually did get to see some culmination in Ellie's discovery of what happened at St. Mary's Hospital, with her discovering that Joel ended up killing the scientists and the surgeon and the fireflies, and that there could have been a cure, and she feels just kind of horrified at this and really felt that Joel took that choice away from her, and that she wanted her life to mean something, and feels that it doesn't as a result of it. And we do see this awkward breakdown between their relationship and this tension between the two of them, which was really interesting, and I would have liked for them to delve into that a little bit more. I think one of the reasons that the developers chose to do this is not only is Ellie kind of loses her way because of this revenge and hatred that she has, but I think part of her emotional emotional breakdown isn't just grief and need for revenge, but it's also a degree of guilt that she has in how she kind of left things with Joel prior to his death, and she never really gets that closure with him that she needed, and I don't think she even really gets it towards the end of the game. We also do see some banter, some interactions with Dina. They do have the odd cute moment of flirtation and banter, and I did enjoy these moments, but these really, for me, they pale in comparison to Ellie's interactions with Joel. Obviously, there's more history there with Joel and Ellie. We've gone through the first game with them. We've seen the evolution of their relationship. So straight from the get-go, we know who they are. We're invested in that relationship. But yes, Ellie has a relationship with Dina and with Jesse. You know, she's known them for 4 years and she's probably grown up with them, and they have a lot of history there. But us as the player, we don't really see that. That's happened in between these two titles, and it does make it harder for us to feel as invested in these relationships and in their banter and interactions. And then as Ellie's side of the story starts to progress, these become more infrequent as Ellie falls more into this kind of revenge and her mental state starts to break down. And there are large segments where you just play Ellie alone, and I did really miss those moments of levity, those moments of banter. This is a really, really brutal world, so I will say that playing The Last of Us Part 2, while I did enjoy the game, it is exhausting. It is mentally and emotionally exhausting because it's just such a dark story, a dark world, that I found myself kind of feeling burnt out after playing 2 to 3 hours of the game, and that's because as you do progress through the story and Ellie loses her mental state, there aren't those moments of levity like we had in the first game, those moments of humanity. You don't really see them here, and that is quite exhausting. I can understand why they did it, because they wanted Ellie to be alone, and that she was losing those ties to her friends and people that she loved because she was being taken over by this hatred. So yeah, I understand why they chose to make that decision, but it is hard to play through it, and it is a hard story to play through too. I absolutely do think that. I know that many have said that Ellie becomes kind of an unlikable character, and I know many are angry with the choices that the writers did make in terms of her character development in the game, that she does make some pretty suspect decisions. She does start to lose elements of her personality and that we knew. So, you know, her joy and zest for life, obviously she has lost this because of the grief that she's going through. There are even moments where there are opportunities that happen in the game where she comes across a PSP, she actually comes across some arcade machines, and the old Ellie that we know and love absolutely would have jumped in, would have grabbed that at the first chance and would have played it. And she doesn't, you know, in the game. She kind of just leaves these, and honestly I don't have a massive issue with that, because I think it does very much tie into what she's going through, and she is losing those parts of herself, and you know, she doesn't have time for all that. She has a mission and she has a goal, and obviously she's very, very laser focused on wanting to get that revenge. So I didn't hate her character. I didn't find her unlikable. In fact, I felt quite saddened for her character. I was heartbroken at seeing how she really was sort of falling apart, and I actually found that kind of interesting to play, and I actually kind of enjoyed it. Now let's touch on the biggest, most controversial element of the game, and that happens halfway through the game, which is you get to a point in the story where Ellie is getting closer and closer and closer and closer to tracking down Abby. With every person that she tracks down, with every WLF base that she finds and members of Abby's team that she kills, she gets closer and closer to tracking her down. She then ends up killing, who we later learn is Meg and Owen, returns to the theatre kind of broken, and we do learn throughout the game that the Dina is pregnant and decides to actually return home. Then in a very sudden twist, Abby turns up, having found Owen and Meg dead, points a gun at Ellie, and it seems like this culmination, this increase in suspense and tension is going to come to a head, and we're finally going to have a confrontation between Abby and Ellie. And then suddenly the game just flips it on its head. that scene fades to black. You're left on a cliffhanger, and suddenly you're thrown into the role of Abby, and it's very, very, very sudden. And we then basically play through Abby really through flashbacks, and we actually end up playing back through the last 3 days of the events of the story. So while we've been doing these things with Ellie, then Abby has been having her own missions and her own events, and we actually get to play through that, and we actually get to see a little bit more on Abby's backstory, who she is and what she's gone through, and who these characters are that we have killed over the last 12 hours. Now, this sudden shift is so sudden that you really feel this kind of whiplash happen to you. And initially, it was a massive letdown. It left me completely reeling, and I felt incredibly frustrated because we went from this incredibly high adrenaline moment to absolutely no payoff. It was a completely painful cliffhanger, and all I cared about at that moment was I just wanted to know what was going to happen to Ellie. I wanted to know if she was going to be okay, if she was going to survive. We see Jesse brutally shot as well. I feel so bad for that character. He did not get the attention and care that he deserved as a character. He had a lot of potential, which in my opinion was kind of wasted. And his death is so sudden. We're just left reeling. We don't even get time to come to terms with it. But you're just left with this no payoff. And it's all I could think about at that point. As soon as we're put into Abby's shoes, I'm like, I don't care. I want to know what happens to Ellie. Take me back to Ellie. I want to know. And that was my first reaction. And it felt like watching your favorite television show that ends on a cliffhanger, and then you are told you have to wait 8 weeks for the story to continue while they run less interesting reruns. That is kind of how it felt, that sort of frustration and no, I don't want to watch it now, I want to know what happens kind of thing. So that was a whiplash just in itself. And then the writers ask you to step into the shoes of the main antagonist, Abby, a person that we have been pretty much told to hate this whole time, and they expect us as players to connect with her. My first visceral reaction was, I don't want to. I have no interest in Abby. She did a horrendous thing. She killed one of my most beloved characters. She killed Joel. Ellie has gone through hell to try to track her down and has done terrible things, and all this culmination, and I didn't feel any connection to her at all. In fact, I still hated her character really viscerally, and I think that's because I did feel for Ellie, and I felt kind of like Ellie in that moment. And I think for some, asking you to suddenly step into the shoes as the main antagonist like that is a tall ask for some. And I think your opinion on the story and how much you enjoyed it will very much hinge on your ability to accept this decision and to connect with Abby. I think it's really elemental to whether or not you like the story or you dislike the story. And I think it's this element really that has polarized the fan base the most. I will say it is a bold and ambitious move on the writers' parts, to say the least, and you've got to kind of give them props for doing it, and I kind of recognize why they did do it. I get what the writers were going for, absolutely. They want us to see that the people in the story are human. The WLF, Abby, her friends, they're not good or bad. They have their own lives and are a product of their environment and the world that they live in, which is brutal. It's a world of survival. And they're not that dissimilar from Ellie and Jackson and her friends in the way, and they really want us to see this, that Joel isn't a saint, that Ellie's actions have very real consequences, and it's all a matter of perspective. We get to see the WF and Abby and her friends from a completely different perspective, which I actually did find interesting. They do consider themselves to be the heroes of their own story. The WF, when we get to actually see them, they run schools, there are children in classrooms and playing, they have friends and loved ones and family and relationships, and we could really compare this to the images that we see of Jackson at the start of the game, and they are not dissimilar. So we are kind of manipulated through this section of Abby's story to feel guilty for the actions that we have taken as Ellie. We get to see the people that we killed in peaceful, ordinary scenarios, going about their daily life, trying to survive. And we even see Abby playing fetch with Alice, her lovable and incredibly loyal canine companion, who we were forced to kill as Ellie earlier on in the story. And this really makes you feel uncomfortable. It's such an uncomfortable feeling. The whole time I was playing as Abby, while I enjoyed her gameplay segments and I did enjoy some of the differences between her and Ellie, there aren't massive differences. I'll get to those in my other review, but I did find that interesting, and yeah, it was incredibly uncomfortable to play through, but I did push myself through it because I thought it was an interesting perspective. And I am a big supporter of writers and developers taking risks and trying something new, and I think it had a lot of potential here. But what I will say is sometimes the writing in these moments did feel incredibly forced, and sometimes the writing is certainly not subtle, you know, even forcing you to play fetch with Alice as Abby. I mean, it's very obvious what the writers are doing there. There isn't that subtlety in their writing. They very much have an agenda. They very much have a way that they want you to feel, and that really does come across. Absolutely. They very clearly paint Ellie to be the bad guy and Abby to be the good guy. But then I suppose in Ellie's story, the reverse is also true. So, you know, again, it's all about perspective. We do also learn the reason for Abby's hatred of Joel and the reason that she actually killed him in a flashback right at the beginning of her segment, where we learn that Abby's father was actually one of the surgeons killed by Joel when he rescued Ellie from St. Mary's Hospital. So there is a little bit of payoff there of learning why she's doing what she is doing. But do I think that Abby's side of the story paid off? Well, there were some elements of Abby's story that I enjoyed and I found interesting, especially when we delved more into the WLF and the scars through Lev's and Yara's storyline, and I loved the added world building that they did. I thought it was interesting to be forced to see events from a different perspective. There were some really cool epic moments, particularly when you get to see this massive battle between the WF and the Scars. And again, it's ramming home that theme of this cycle of hatred, the cycle of violence. You know, violence begets violence, that it's just pointless. It destroys everybody involved. And those messages are very obvious, if not really written subtly. But there were some epic moments most definitely in it. But did I ever really connect with Abby and the side cast of characters? Well, while I understood her more and I understood her motives, in terms of the writing, no, I never really connected with Abby and the side cast of characters, and I think that's one of the biggest issues I might have had with this side of the story. I just thought that the side cast of characters were not as engaging or as interesting as those found in the first game. I didn't really like Manny all that much. I really couldn't care less. You know, when he died, I didn't really feel anything. I found Owen interesting, especially when we do see his sense of like exhaustion and just how tired he is with this continued cycle of violence, and, you know, him wanting to break free of that and wanting to escape Seattle and start a new life with Abby. But then the writers make him part of an incredibly awkward and pointless love triangle between a pregnant Mel and Abby, and he becomes kind of a cheating scumbag, and it's really hard to like the guy when, you know, he can't be honest with either woman and make a decision. It just makes it really uncomfortable, and then we're forced to watch this really uncomfortable like sex scene between him and Abby, which just was really uncomfortable to watch, and I didn't really know where to look or how to feel. It was very uncomfortable. And then of course there's Mel, you know, who I absolutely hated. I just found her really annoying. I was kind of slightly horrified at her disregard for her unborn baby, as she repeatedly put herself at risk going out, you know, onto the front lines, and everyone just seemed okay with this, which I just found incredibly reckless, really selfish, and just extremely unlikable. So because I didn't like Mel, I didn't really feel anything for her, and I just found her scenes really, really awkward and really annoying. The only characters I did somewhat like and find interesting really was Lev and Yara, but that's mostly because of the insight that they gave into the Scar or Seraphite culture, and also the role that they played in Abby's redemption story as she comes to terms with the death of her father ultimately and finds some peace by helping others. But honestly, apart from that and the obvious comparisons between Lev and Abby and Joel and Ellie, obviously that's what the writers were going for there. But honestly, they didn't really add anything to Abby and Ellie's Revenge story plot line, and they kind of felt pretty redundant and sort of out of place, like a really weird side tangent that the story went off on. So overall, I just felt that there was too much time and attention given to Abby, almost kind of at the expense of Ellie. As I said, just to be very clear, I didn't have a problem with Abby as a character. I don't have a problem with the way that she looked and, you know, what happens to the character and her actions. I actually thought Laura Bailey did an amazing job with her delivery and portrayal. And I didn't really have an issue with playing as Abby. I actually thought that element was really interesting. But what I would have liked is for that segment of the story to have been much, much shorter and used as more of a means to shed some light on events and make the player question their actions, and eventually as a catalyst for Ellie's eventual redemption, which in the end kind of feels rushed. You know, when we actually go back to Ellie, the last act of the game felt incredibly rushed. I mean, Ellie doesn't even really find out why Abby killed Joel, which is ridiculous. She should have found out the reason why. It could have been an opportunity for the two of them to realize that they're actually not that dissimilar and to learn to forgive and let go. That could have been a really good character development moment. Also, we see Ellie show some remorse and psychological trauma for the lives that she has taken, but we don't ever really get to see Abby show remorse for killing Joel and Ellie's friends, and that really bothered me. So I think the second half of the game does really have problems with the pacing, and that really does show, and I think that needed to be a bit shorter and then a longer third act. I think that would have been much better for the story and the pacing. Let's talk about the Ellie boss fight then, because obviously both these storylines, Ellie and Abby storylines, do meet in the middle, and they come to a head where we return to the both of them, and we do finally catch up in the storyline and return to the face-off between Abby and Ellie. But then uncomfortably again, we are still in the shoes of Abby, and you're actually asked at this moment to kill Ellie, and this moment was so friggin' uncomfortable for me. This, more than any other moment, showed me that I did not connect with Abby as much as I did with Ellie, because my first instinct in that moment was to throw myself at Ellie and just allow Abby to die. I was literally chanting to myself, if you kill Ellie in this way, I am done. That is literally how I felt. And I would rather sacrifice Abby than have to kill Ellie. It really reminded me of that moment in Mass Effect 3 where you get to the end of the game and you have to choose between the control, synthesis and destroy endings. And you don't really agree with any of them. And that gut reaction of wanting to just stand there and refuse to finish the game kind of happened in this moment with the Ellie boss fight. But of course there is no choice here, and we are forced to play through the fight. And I will say that the fight was incredibly well handled. It was so intense. The cinematography and animations in this fight and the music that plays throughout it as well was just so well crafted that it is a really impactful moment. And the fight is just brutal, even to the point where we think that Abby is gonna kill Dina. Ellie actually reveals that Dina is pregnant, which Abby doesn't seem to have a problem with, which was really disturbing considering she'd gone through this redemption storyline, and then obviously only Lev stepping in stops that from happening. And it's Lev's influence that ultimately causes Abby to agree to let Ellie and Dina go. And Lev is sort of Abby's conscience in this scene, sort of the way that Ellie was Joel's conscience in The Last of Us. And you know, that's how we kind of end. And then we suddenly have a time skip and we see Ellie living this really beautiful, tranquil life with the woman that she loves, an adorable child called JJ, which is Dina and Jesse's son. And it seems almost unreal. It's almost like dreamlike, like a dreamscape. And it's beautiful. It's gorgeous. Like, there's so many people would kill to have this kind of life, not only in today's standards, but most definitely in the world of The Last of Us and in this post-apocalyptic world. So we see this beautiful situation, and at this point, I think this would have been the perfect way for the writers to actually finish the game. You know, Ellie had learned to let go. She discovered what really mattered most in this moment, which is the people that she loved, which was the future and living for Dina and for JJ. And she'd found a way to live on and to continue to pass on all that Joel had taught her, you know, honoring his memory. I wasn't bothered about the fact that this was a happy ending. It was more of the case that it just felt like this point tied it up quite nicely, and it made sense in you know, the overall grand scheme of things. But then the writers just couldn't leave well enough alone, and they did a final act, which in my opinion wasn't necessary. And that was the final act where we get to see heartbreaking scenes of Ellie suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome. Tommy then shows up and, in a completely out of character move, tries to goad Ellie and guilt Ellie into restarting her hunt for Abby. Ellie then makes the baffling decision to leave a loving family and a peaceful life and just leave that all behind to go on this quest for revenge again. And I don't know, for me it just seems senseless again, and it just seemed pointless. She tracks Abby to Santa Barbara, where she runs into a group called the Rattlers. She then finds a captured Abby who is strung up viciously on a tree, which is just a horrendous scene. Decides to then cut her down, and then decides to have a brutal fist fight, which looked amazing and played out amazingly. But then as you're going through this fist fight and dodging and ducking and weaving, and you ultimately overpower Abby, and it seems like, you know, Ellie at this point is finally, you know, she's going to get her revenge finally. Ellie then sees a flashback of Joel, stops herself, and decides to let Abby and Lev go. And then she returns home to an empty house, has lost everything, including 2 of her fingers and her ability to play the guitar, which is her last connection to Joel. And it's just one of the most depressing endings of any game. The game, when I finished it, it just left me feeling empty and hollow. Maybe that's what the writers were going for. Maybe they wanted us to feel like Ellie in that moment, empty, hollow, that the revenge that she had, you know, been seeking to take had cost her everything. But it just felt like, what was the point? You didn't end up killing Abby anyway. It would have made more sense if she had killed Abby, and then that was a very definite message from the writer saying, well, she chose to go down that path and these are the consequences of choosing to do that. That would have made more sense for me. Or even perhaps giving the players the choice, you know, letting players in that moment decide, do you kill Abby or do you let it go, let her go, and ultimately forgive yourself and forgive her. I think that might have been quite a powerful, ambitious move, which they never really went down and they never chose to do. And it kind of feels like a missed opportunity. It certainly would have made for some interesting discussions on social media. So I really felt that the last final act of the story did really let it down, and the ending of The Last of Us Part 2 did really let it down too. And if I'm honest, I don't really feel a need to go back and play it because the story is so dark, so harrowing. Your experience throughout it as well is so hard. It's such a difficult story to play through. There are moments of levity, but not enough to balance, you know, the moments of darkness. We do get some flashbacks with Joel, which I really enjoyed, but not enough of them. I would have liked more Joel and Ellie in the game, most definitely. So yeah, I don't really feel a need to, you know, play it again at the moment. Maybe I need some time to let it settle before I jump in again and maybe try New Game Plus. And I'm not really excited about the possibility of a future sequel, because I just don't see where they're gonna go. Maybe, you know, The Last of Us Part 2 is gonna focus on Abby and Lev, and that's what they're gonna do. Abby and Lev will become the new Joel and Ellie, but honestly, I don't really want to see that. So I'm not massively interested for part 3. So I guess ultimately, I didn't hate the story. I can see where the writers were going and what they wanted to achieve. I can understand logically where they were going for, and certainly I think, you know, it was an ambitious move, and I can see that the designs behind all the different events and what they wanted to achieve. But I think in their need to focus on their message and their overarching theme, they really forgot one very key important reason for the success of the first game, and that is the characters and their relationships, and that slow build, subtle writing of the original that was slowly allowed to develop and ultimately paid off in the end. And I feel like the story suffered a lot with pacing issues. There definitely were some inconsistencies and some contrived, convenient writing here and there. But ultimately, I do think it had promise that could have paid off, but it never really did pay off. I still like my idea of Joel tracking down a Revenge for Ellie, and that's what I would have written, but obviously I'm not hired by Naughty Dog, I'm not a writer, but that's what I would have gone down. I think that might have had more positive reaction. But anyway, that's the story. I have to review the story as it is, and those are generally my thoughts and analysis of the storyline, the parts I liked, what my impression were on the way the story was going, and what I would have changed. So, you know, there are my thoughts on the story. Obviously, it's quite a long video. It's like a 45-minute video. So thank you if you stuck by and watched this whole thing. Really appreciate it. My spoiler-free review will be a lot shorter, I promise you. But I hope you enjoyed this video anyway. I hope you enjoyed hearing my thoughts on the story. Let me know what your thoughts are in the comment section below. What you thought of Abby, what you thought of the side cast of characters, the story pacing, the turns that the story took, Joel's death. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, how you feel about those points and what your general thoughts were on the storyline. As I say, my next video will focus on a spoiler-free review of the game in its entirety. So looking at the gameplay, the music, the animations, the visual style of the game. I'll touch upon the story a little bit, but it will be very brief and very, very general, because obviously I've gone into a lot more detail here today. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. It's massive analysis. Hope you enjoyed it anyway. Of course, take care, and as always, happy gaming. Bye, guys.